I would want to thank all those who worked on this, especially Patricia Haidamous, who was leading the project on drought, and Malak Tufaili. Assisting them in many facets were Sonia Zgheib, Sarah Halwani, and Berna Ismail. We welcome today an esteemed group of panelists. We have from Cyprus Institute, Professor Manfred Lange. He is the director of the Energy, Environment, and Water Research Center. And Mr. Fidele Byiringiro, he is from the UN ESCWA Sustainable Development and Policies Division. We were hoping to have Dr. Munsif Rikaya from the Tunisian Ministry of Agriculture and Ms. Randa Nimr from the Lebanese Ministry of Energy and Water. The former had great difficulties getting clearance from the Tunisian authorities to leave for Lebanon. We are still trying to get him on Skype later this morning. Ms. Nimr was called to a parliamentary meeting on behalf of the ministry. Therefore, we will actually have a shorter program than was originally planned. Nevertheless, we are certain that we will have a most fruitful discussion with good information to be presented, especially by our IFI drought research team. I would like to start also. There's Dr. Nadim Farajalla. He is the Faculty Research Director of the Climate Change Program at IFI, and he is a associate professor at the Faculty of Agriculture and Food Sciences here at AUB. I would like to start with Dr. Manfred. No, we start with ESCWA. Okay, we will start with the ESCWA presentation first, and then move to Dr. Manfred.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. First of all, I would like to apologize because it was our director who was supposed to be here, Mrs. Rura Majdalani, but she was caught up in some other assignments, so she couldn't be here. And also, my other colleague, Dr. Ralph Klingberg, is the one who has been dealing with the Ministry of Water and Energy, the Ministry of Environment of Water here in Lebanon. They have been doing a couple of meetings, or coordination meetings, but him also, he was assigned, he's currently in Oman on another mission, so here I am to present the paper. Basically at ESCWA, we've been arguing a little bit on which way to approach the drought issue. We thought that maybe the technical part is a little bit, we could leave that part of the technical part to the researchers who are much more well-equipped than ESCWA would do. So we have been concentrating mostly on building the structure and seeing how member countries could improve their coordination in order to manage the drought. Of course, as you know, the region is really in an area of water scarcity. It's one of the most water scarce in the region, as the map in the world, as the map here shows. Most countries of the region, you could see that most countries of the region have their water overexploited. And from this graph, you could see that most of the region, especially where the population is located, are generally very vulnerable to drought. And this is causing a population displacement like in Syria, where people are leaving the western part toward the eastern part, but that was before the war. And then in Iraq, as you can see by the map that was created by the International Organization for Migration, where the red part are where most of the people have been displaced. And you could see that it's mostly between the two big rivers. Our Secretary General last year said that droughts are hard to avert, but the effects can be mitigated. The price of preparedness is minimal compared to the cost of disaster relief. So he was suggesting that we should therefore try to manage the crisis a little bit better so that we could prepare and build against resilience. To this end, that's where we've been trying to assess the countries of the region in terms of how they react to drought. And we found that mostly all the countries of the region are largely reactive to the drought issue. They tend to act with no contingency plans, and usually after the drought has happened, there's little proactive or preventive activities where actions would be planned in advance with stakeholders' participation and with a good early warning system in place. So most of the countries are reactive, including Morocco and Tunisia, but for those two countries at least, they have made a few improvements in the way they have structured their overall setup to combat the drought. I had thought that maybe the Tunisian expert would be here to present their case. So I had consulted mostly on Morocco, as you could see below. But the main issue is that we should try to push our countries to move from the reactive part and be a little bit more proactive. To this end, there is the Mediterranean Medroplan guidelines, which have been put in place and which could be used by countries in order to try to build the system to combat drought. As you can see, the major guidelines revolves around the four major issues: the organizational, methodology, the operational, and then the feedback, the public review. The organizational part deals with the whole setup, the institutional framework, the linkages among the various stakeholders, while the methodological part deals with the indicators and trying to identify what would be the triggers to declare a drought. Then you have the operational part where you put all those into the process of averting and early warning of the system for combating drought. And then, of course, you have the public review where there's a need for a feedback and a constant reassessment of the whole plan that has been put in place, so that countries, so that the plan could evolve with time, and especially after each plan, as most probably they would see where the mistakes have been made, and so that they could be corrected. So in this presentation, I'll concentrate more on the organizational part, which deals with which calls for a management of the drought and a better management of the drought, linking the various institutions, the various stakeholders, bringing them into the fold so that they could all together combat the advent of drought. The organizational part allows the understanding of how the whole institutional framework works, so that it could play a more effective, so that the whole institutional framework put together that could play a more effective integrated part in drought management. At the end of this organizational process, of course, you should have identified all the institutions and organizations involved and all the stakeholders. And that would go from the national level to the governorate or basin level and up down to the local level. So all the institutions will be described together with their activities, and a proper relationship would be established so that everybody would be clear who is on what and who's doing what. Of course, a proper information system would have to be put in place to allow for a better data collection and analysis of the data. So this is the structure in Morocco. As you can see from the red line, they have tried to go all the way from the national to regional to local, with all the main actors playing a role. And they have established this National Drought Observatory, which is supposed to deal with all the issues related to analyzing the data and trying to make the forecast. However, there's still some major gaps in the system. Because although they have a good structure, there's still not an independent body which deals with drought specifically. Even the NDO is mostly involved in on other issues. And then there's still very weak linkages with coordination among the various ministries, like the Ministry of Water and the Ministry of Agriculture. They're still not getting along that well.
Later.
And of course, there is that in each ministry, there's still a lack of a proper unit that would deal with the issue related to drought, analyzing and designing the proper messages that could be broadcasted on the outside world. The NDO, the National Drought Organization, has been put in place, but it's not fully functional yet. They haven't had the full system working so that they could give a proper analysis and a proper assessment of how the whole issue of drought is going in. And then you have the Palestinian case where they have put in place a task force which revolves around the Palestinian Water Authority and the Ministry of Agriculture, as those are the two main ministries working on agriculture-related issues. So each has its own assignment in order to mitigate, to prepare, and to conduct relief and reconstruction. And of course, also the Ministry of Agriculture has the same the same setup as the Ministry of Water. From our analysis, we have tried to identify the major gaps that exist in countries of the region. So you have one of the major issues is that there is usually not a proper unit responsible for drought management. That lacks in almost all the countries. There's a lack of proper standard management approach, and together with an early warning system, ACSAD has tried to put one in Syria, but it works only at a limited scale in one basin. But it's a good example of what could be done if it was to be expanded all over Syria. So drought projection and the mitigation plans are very weak also. And of course, the integration of this integrated water resources management into the whole process of the development plan. In Lebanon, this was the area that my colleague Raf Klingberg has been dealing with. From what I understood from him, there is a ministerial council and inter-ministerial council which try to deal with the drought issue, and a task force has been established, and they had already one meeting. But I hope somebody from Lebanon would provide more update on this. And of course, there is the parliamentary session, which there's a parliamentary committee within the parliament which deals with drought. These are the recommendations that Ralph was proposing for Lebanon. He was suggesting that there should be more coordination, cooperation, and concerted actions, and then to establish a national strategy to overcome water scarcity by strengthening the water scarcity task force and linking a little bit better the various stakeholders involved. There would be a need to build a properly functioning national monitoring network and to conduct appropriate research. Actually, there's one slide I had removed where he showed that there was some work done by BGR in the catchment of where they have put in place various monitoring stations at various altitude, and where they could collect very nice data that could be used for drought monitoring. Of course, there is also the need to better to reinforce the legal basis on how to deal with all these issues. Especially here, he was trying to highlight that there would be a need to establish a national high water council that could overlook all the activities of the on water issues, both from the Ministry of Agriculture and from the Ministry of Environment and others. Thank you.
Dr. Hajian, if you would be so kind as to start with your questions.
Thank you. It was answered in the presentation.
Excellent. We're open to questions if you would like to ask.
How in your opinion, would you mentioned the need for countries to be more proactive to water management rather than reactive. How, in your opinion, is the best way to engage countries or multi-country partnerships in large watersheds to become more proactive in their approach to water management?
Yeah, this is one of the major issues we are trying to answer, not only for the drought issue, but on most all other issues. Because the issue of cooperation in the region, notably on water, is to some extent really difficult to convince the country to cooperate and to come together to establish logical plans that the countries could be implementing. So we're trying to push it through, hopefully through the General Assembly, to see if the region could adopt a general framework for cooperation and integration that could hopefully would push countries to collaborate a little bit more on all issues related to water, but also on other issues like peace and development and things like that.
Any more questions? Yes, please.
Thank you. Actually, I have two quick questions. First one is related to the vulnerability map that you showed to us. I don't know if this is the work of ESCWA or somebody else, but I'm interested to know if this is this is an environmental vulnerability map or a socioeconomic vulnerability map in relation to drought? How vulnerability was assessed? And my second question, what is the point of view here of ESCWA, given that you showed us some quick examples from how they are managing drought in different Arab regions? Is it really that we need probably to have an exclusive strategy for managing drought, or this could be integrated in water strategy, for instance?
Yeah, that first map of the world was built using a water scarcity index. We don't have, in ESCWA, we don't have a special unit to deal with those kind of issues, but we collaborated with UNEP. That was a map from UNEP, GRIDA. So they're the one who developed it, but it was established based on this water scarcity index, which we've been trying to estimate for all the countries of the regions. Otherwise, your second question was on how ESCWA, what ESCWA is doing. Basically, we are trying to help countries to build or reinforce their institutions and to try to cooperate a little bit more. Of course, you have these specialized agencies. Those are the ones working mostly at the country level to try. The specialized agencies like UNDP, FAO, or UNESCO, they try directly to work with each country individually to collect the data on water. But ESCWA's role is to try to bring all the countries of the region together to try to see if they can reach a more harmonious way of dealing with all these issues. So in this case, we are mainly working with the League of Arab States through Dr. Jabala to try to see if the League of Arab States could adopt specific resolutions that could push the countries of the region to collaborate a little bit more. But of course, it's difficult. But in the long run, we hope that we'll be able to establish a proper result.
Okay, one more question. No more questions? Okay, okay, then we can move to Dr. Manfred now.
Well, good morning. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers and the host of this meeting for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here. It's my second visit to Lebanon, so I'm happy to be back. Now, after having this nice overview over a larger region, or the region of the MENA region, if you wish, I would really like to focus down. I would like to focus down on a fairly small country where I come from, Cyprus. To start with, let me just give you very few facts. Oh no, let me start with an outline, I'm sorry. I wanted to start with a brief background and introduction into my little presentation, talk about the current situation with regards to water, and very briefly touch on future projections. By the way, I should say, I'm coming from the natural sciences, so I'm not a political scientist nor a social scientist, so my talk will be sort of flavored more by natural sciences than by political or social sciences. I hope you forgive me. Anyway, so then I'll talk about the current drought policy or policies in Cyprus and its successes and shortcomings, and will more or less end with some recommendations which are somewhat generic. And in fact, I should mention at this point, even though I'm talking about Cyprus, as I said, a small country, I think there is a lot of implications that can be drawn and gathered for the region as a whole, so I hope. And then add with some conclusions. Now back to Cyprus. Cyprus is a country almost as big as Lebanon, which doesn't mean much, but still. But the population is only about a quarter of your country. However, every year we have an inflow of tourists into the country, which double or triple the overall population. Now, this is, aside from the economic implications, of course, this has implications for water as well. As you can imagine, tourists need water, and so does the population. So that's why I'm mentioning it here. Secondly, the population is, at least according to projections by the World Bank, slightly going to rise in the foreseeable future, which is, at least with regard to Central European standards, somewhat unusual. So again, this sort of sets a little bit of the stage as far as demographics and the size of the country is concerned. Now let me go to an issue that I think has already been touched on, but which is of course of vital importance, climate change. And I'm just bringing up this picture, which is slightly dated, which is actually very similar to the picture you showed for the present. In other words, this shows water scarcity or the decrease in precipitation as it is projected in the next 50 to 100 years. And everything you see in reds and oranges and yellows indicate a decrease in precipitation. And as you can easily see, the Mediterranean basin, again in accordance with what we see today, has been coined a climate change hotspot for that very reason. In other words, climate change will have drastic impacts on water availability and water scarcity. Now, if you take a closer look at this map, you'll see that in order to derive more concrete, say, impacts or more concrete manifestations of climate change on a smaller scale, you need to do what we call regional climate modeling. And don't worry, I'm not going to go into any detail on that. I'm just going to have one slide where I give you some examples of what this looks like on the scale of the Eastern Mediterranean. Now, the current precipitation regime in Cyprus, and we're blessed with a fairly long record of precipitations. And again, I'm not going to go into any detail here. All I want you to do is to focus on the red bars, which indicate very dry conditions. These are annual precipitation values for Cyprus. And if you look more closely, the bottom line here is that in recent decades, very dry years are on the rise. In other words, they have become more numerous, indicating a general trend towards water scarcity and decreasing precipitation, which I think is, of course, an indication of increasing droughts. Now, drought, therefore, has been on the news all the time. Just two examples of this year. This was in February. This was, I think, in March or whatever. I can't really read it. So people, of course, are aware. People are worried. The first one, I think, is interesting because it has implication to what I'm going to talk about next year and very soon. It says, despite drought, no water cuts this year. This is mainly due to the fact that potable water, drinking water in Cyprus is going to be, or is already being supplied entirely by desalination. In other words, any variation in precipitation is not really an issue. It's an economic issue, but again, I'll leave this aside for the moment. Now, just as I said, one slide giving you an indication of what regional climate modeling can do in terms of depicting more precisely how climate change is going to manifest itself. This is a group of, or these are two slides indicating the changes in annual mean precipitation. And again, I'm not going to go into any detail. The slide on your left is a projection for the time slot 2040 to 2069, and the right one is in the further future from 2070 to 2099. All you want to take home from this map, or from these maps, which compare present precipitation versus the future precipitation, is that there is decrease in precipitation that these models clearly indicate in the region of the Eastern Mediterranean. Another way to look at it is illustrated in the slides below. The left slide shows the number of days with heavy precipitation, and red dots indicate decreasing heavy precipitation. In other words, precipitation that really matter in terms of bringing water. The right slide shows the number of dry days. Here, the red dots indicate an increase in dry days relative to the present. And again, you can see that there's quite a bit of red dots, particularly in Turkey and in Greece. I don't have time to go into that, why that is, but just take it as is. You can see that the results, of course, are compatible, indicating, again, a decrease in precipitation in the foreseeable future. Now, drought policies in Cyprus. Drought policies are actually obligatory for Cyprus, being a member of the European Union. We are obliged to the EU Water Framework Directive, and part of that directive is actually the drafting of a drought management plan. In that regard, I think Cyprus is in a sense blessed, because we're forced to do things that you alluded to. In other words, take actually a proactive view on droughts and drought mitigation. The drought plan was, a first comprehensive drought plan was finalized in 2010, and there have been a number of updates in the following years. Now, the drought plan, the drought management plan, basically looks at a number of indices that are based on data and relates that to measures, consequences, and actions that are, and there is a relationship defined between the indices and the measures that have to be taken as a consequence of these indices. Unfortunately, I don't have really time to go into that, but I'll have one more slide on that. For that purpose, the country is subdivided into 9 hydrological regions, and for each region, data are being collected and are being analyzed and are then mapped onto actions and measures that these regions should take. Now, as I said, actually, I haven't said that. The primary index is that is being used in the analysis is the standard precipitation index, which relates the duration of a current drought to droughts in the previous or in the recent past. That's a major data-based index. Oops. And in addition, there are a number of other indices that are being collected: wet period runoff index, hydrological year runoff index, and this is really important, a dam storage capacity index. I'll come back to that in a moment. These indices are then, as I said, looked at, classified, and are being transformed in alert levels. Again, I'm not going to go into any detail here, but what you can see is that there are a number of stages, if you wish, of drought management alerts that are being taken based on the value of the main index, the standard precipitation index, and as well as on the value of the other indices. I think this system is pretty robust. it provides really a solid foundation for measures to be taken by the people in the region or in these hydrological regions. And I think in that regard, Cyprus is pretty well prepared. Now, to go back to the sort of basics, water in Cyprus, as in many other countries in the region, is primarily for agriculture. As you can see in this graph, about 2/3 or almost 2/3 is going to irrigation, a quarter or so to domestic population and so forth. These are the two major consumers of water. Now, water is supplied by a government body, the government waterworks. And again, down here you can see for a year in the past how this water was that is supplied through the government waterworks is being utilized. Again, agriculture dominates. However, and I don't know if this is true for Lebanon as well, but it's true for many other countries in the region, there are what I would call private wells. And interestingly, if you take a look at that, you can see that these private wells account almost for half, or actually it's pretty much half of the overall demand. They are even more dominated by agriculture. In other words, farmers drill wells, and whenever they need, they extract water without the government actually knowing about it, because it's not part of the government waterworks. Now, let's leave it with that. But I mean, of course, if you look at this, this of course has implications for the overall water management of the country, and subsequently, of course, also for the drought management plan. But again, I'll leave it with that. It's just a sign of how these issues are handled in a small country like Cyprus. Now, Cyprus has been dealing with droughts for millennia. It's a very long-standing problem. And one of the major drought mitigation measures was to build dams. In the 70s and 80s, Cyprus built a large number of dams aiming to no drop to the sea policies. In other words, all the precipitation that fell on the island was to be kept on the island and not run off to the sea. Storage volume increased dramatically. This is, by the way, not the last number here, the 87 million cubic meters. However, if you look at the filling or at the water volume that is stored in the dams, and this is a time series, you can see dramatic variations from year to year. And this is due to the variation in precipitation that I showed you earlier. And of course, if there's no precipitation, there's no water in the dams. It's as simple as that. And you can see, particularly 2007, 2008 were drastic years. And if you look at this year, we're below the long-term mean. And graphically, you can see what that means. I mean, these are two pictures from a dam in Cyprus in a good year in 2012. Oh, no, what is it? In 2004, and then in 2008. And I think this goes without any more explanations. This is what happens. And obviously, if you are not prepared for this running empty of dams, then you are in bad shape. Now, just to illustrate this point with one more slide, the Water Development Department publishes every day, or even more frequently, the water volume in all the major dams in Cyprus. And what you can see here in blue are the filling or the volumes of water in the dams as of the 15th of October, a few days ago. And you can see the major dam is the Kuris Dam, and then there are others, but you can see that the dams are pretty empty already. If you compare that to the situation exactly 1 year past, you can see that there's a drastic reduction, attesting to what the newspaper said: we have a drought that is being upon us. Now, Another major measure that has been taken in the country that I already touched on is desalination. Potable water supply indeed has been in the past increasingly been supplied through desalination. These are the red bars that you can see here as a function of time. And you can see that ever since the late 80s, the amount of water supply through desalination has drastically increased. In fact, by the way, the mean supply of water for the last 10 years or so is 66 million cubic meters. Now, if you look at desalination and the recent developments in that, you can see that recently, or over the last few years, about 2/3 of the total water supply for drinking has been supplied through desalination. This is a fairly costly alternative. It costs about 218 million euros. And on the other hand, it contributes to, since these desalination plants are very energy hungry, it accounts for 4% of the total electricity consumption in Cyprus, and thereby, because electricity is produced conventionally with hydrocarbons, it contributes to the CO2 emissions of the country. Now, recently, the government has, or more or less recently, has issued a new policy, and I already alluded to that, where they say that seawater desalination would make urban and tourist water demand independent of the vagaries of weather, meaning precipitation. In other words, the government is going to supply all the water that's needed for human consumption through desalination. In fact, if you look at the numbers, the capacity of desalination plants that are being installed surpasses the current need by about 30%. So that's another, I think, major measure to fight droughts, at least as far as human consumption is concerned. Now, if you look at the overall situation of the drought policies in Cyprus, there are successes and there are some shortcomings. Let me start with the successes. I think a major success is indeed that the National Drought Management Plan is in place. Again, as I said, it's obligatory for Cyprus, but it's a good thing that Cyprus has it. Secondly, and this goes back to what you alluded to some of the countries, Cyprus, after a long, long time of also having all sorts of government agencies involved in water management, agreed on having one ministry as the lead ministry, or as the sole ministry to administer water, namely the Ministry of Agriculture, Natural Resources and Environment, and the Water Development Department is a sort of executive branch of the ministry administering the water use in Cyprus. Water supply is largely secured through major infrastructure projects, and here I mean the dams or reservoirs and the desalination plants. Supply of water is thereby secured, potable water. The dams and the reservoirs supply a large amount of the irrigation water, and this has really led to Cyprus being quite productive as far as irrigated agriculture is concerned. I don't have time to go into that graph, but the orange or yellow and the red dashed line indicate the agricultural productivity. The yellow line shows the rain-fed agriculture, in other words, depending on precipitation, and the red line shows the productivity of irrigated agriculture, and you can see there's a tremendous increase in productivity if you're able to irrigate your fields and your crops. And the use of treated wastewater is on the rise, even though there's still a lot of potential, but it is being implemented increasingly. Now, shortcomings, there are shortcomings, and I'm just looking at the crisis year 2007, 2008. Remember when we looked at precipitation and the dam filling, you saw that really was a year of severe drought. And despite the drought planning that has been going on, the drastically reduced irrigation water also led to decreasing supply for the farmers, as indicated in this slide and the previous one. You can see that for 2008, the amount of water that farmers received was far below the long-term mean. And here again come the private wells in to some extent. So farmers were able to subtract or extract water from their private wells to at least somewhat compensate the lack of government provided water, thereby at least reducing the vulnerability to water scarcity in their production. Another consequence, a drastic consequence, was that in 2008, water was being shipped from Greece by tanker ships, 8 million cubic meters at a cost of 42 million euros. So 1 cubic meter cost about 5 euros, which is a hefty price tag as far as other water prices are concerned. So again, despite the good planning, despite, I think, a fairly well-developed infrastructure, Cyprus still, every now and then, is subject to a crisis. And I hope this year will not be a crisis, but we will have to see. Now, there are, of course, lots of things one can do in addition to what has been done, and this should enter, actually, the drought management plan of Cyprus as well. So I think one important issue is that we need a longer-term planning for irrigation water supply. Right now, it's really on a yearly basis. There's an assessment of the water in the dams, and in April, farmers are being alerted of the amount of water that they can expect, and that's about it. So a longer-term, forward-looking planning, I think, is really an improvement that needs to be implemented. On the other hand, we don't have really good plans for flooding, with the result that if we have a heavy rainfall event, like 2 years ago, or 1 year ago, I forget, in Nicosia, you see that this flooding can cause some damage, and it needs to be addressed. Artificial recharge of groundwater reservoirs through check dams is another measure that is already being implemented but needs to be enhanced. Recharge of groundwater in severely depleted aquifers by tertiary treated sewage water is yet another measure. On a smaller scale, improved rainfall runoff management in use in urban areas. Oh, that's actually not a small issue. I'll come back to that in a moment. And rainwater harvesting is a measure that should be taken into account. Improved leakage detection in urban water supply systems, drought-tolerant crops and natural vegetation such as olives, barley, and other shrubs need to be implemented more heavily. Rainwater harvesting in agriculture is actually being practiced at a very low level and should be enhanced. And finally, something that is very close to us, to the Cyprus Institute, we are advocating seawater desalination through solar energy sources. And unfortunately, I don't have time to go into that, even though I would like to. So these are some recommendations. Let me just give you one example as to what I mean by urban water drainage management. We did a study for Limassol, the second largest city in Cyprus. I'm not going to go into any detail here. On the right-hand side, you see the runoff or the usage of water. And the point to notice is that about 1/3 of the water that is part of the water budget for Limassol runs off into the sea instead of being captured by a drainage system that would utilize the rainwater that is falling in heavy rainfall events and is running off to the sea. Now, let me conclude. Cyprus is currently experiencing increasing temperature and decreasing precipitation. I think I showed that quite clearly and future climate in Cyprus will be characterized by even warmer and drier summers and milder and less rainy winters. This is results that we derive from our modeling. Drought management plan is in place, but longer term planning is needed. Major drought measures secure potable water supply and almost or mostly sufficient irrigation water, which I think is a plus. Reliance on desalination is costly, and because it's done with hydrocarbon energy sources, unsustainable, and planning needs to take into account what I call the private wells in order to be comprehensive. And with that, I'll end, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Manfred. We'll take a few questions now. Yes, Michelle.
Hello. I believe that Cyprus is divided, right? There's the Greek side and the Turkish side. And the Greek side abides by the EU rules and guidelines, right? Including the WFD, the WFD, the Water Framework Directive. Okay. So the drought policy, is it only for the Greek side?
That's correct.
Okay, does that trigger like social and economical differences between the two sides, even within one country?
Yes, that's a story in itself. I don't know if I should go into that, but your observation is correct. What I reported on is for the Republic of Cyprus. That's to say the Greek Cypriot part of Cyprus. I mean, obviously, our colleagues in the north are also dealing with drought. However, they're not part of the EU, therefore they have other boundary conditions, if you wish, to deal with it. But I'm pretty sure they also deal with it. And I don't know if you heard, a major measure is actually implemented as we speak, namely a pipeline from Turkey to the northern part of Cyprus, supplying, I think, more than they need in terms of drinking water once it's implemented. That's a very costly alternative to doing things, but as I say, as we speak, it's being implemented, and once it's there, I think water supply is fairly secure in the north as well.
Okay. Another question?
Is water governance in Cyprus happening at the national level, or are there also activities happening at the basin and local level, and what do those look like?
In fact, I mean, in terms of the Water Framework Directive, Cyprus is supposed to be one water basin or one catchment basin. But as you see, or as I've shown you, we have 9 hydrological districts. So in terms of the drought management plan, they are being treated separately, or individually, if you wish, based on, again, on observations that are being carried out in these districts. Now, as you've seen, and coming back to the first question, these districts actually do include the northern part of Cyprus as well. So for the time being, they are not actually part of the drought plan as far as the Republic of Cyprus is concerned. If we ever find ways of reuniting, then this would change, hopefully. Yes. Please.
Do the regional basins have any autonomy to choose how they'll structure their plan, or is that dictated by the water management?
Basically, there are sort of water directorates for the different districts. They have a fairly large autonomy. However, there is the Water Development Department under the Ministry of Agriculture and so forth, this sort of central body that administers water, that sort of sets the larger scale policy objectives and guidelines. But they do have autonomy, that's correct. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Dr. Lange. It's a very informative presentation. Roland Riachi from Issam Fares Institute. I was wondering, where were you situated this year in the Euro Drought index that you presented? And just another question is, we'd like also, for sure, to present it more, the private wells. Where are they now in the long-term drought policy? Because we have the same private wells.
Yeah.
Where are they situated in your long-term vision of drought policy?
Good question. Well, to the first part, we are on alert, obviously, because of the situation. You've seen the. I don't think I mentioned that. We are about at 30% volume in the dams compared to actually 60% last year of the same date. So obviously we are in the state of alert as far as water supply is concerned. This concerns primarily agriculture. As I mentioned, potable water, as long as we can pay for it, we don't care, quote unquote, because desalination takes care of it.
But this desalination, sorry, what is the cost average of desalination?
It's about €1 per cubic meter. So it's above the selling price. So I mean there are lots of implications in terms of the government subsidizing and so forth.
Okay.
But okay, now what was the second point?
The private wells, where are they in the vision of this drought?
Management? Well, to be honest with you, if you talk to the Water Development Department, they're a bit quiet about that. I know that there are plans to actually utilize quite sophisticated methods of remote sensing to identify farmlands that are known not to receive government water. If they do well, then something has to happen. In other words, so indirectly, they try to assess the extent of water extraction by non-government waterworks. Yeah, correct, right. So I don't know where they stand, to be honest with you. I mean, but I heard
compensation plans, for instance, because we are in the same situation in Lebanon. We are.
we
have 50,000 private wells, while we have 600 public wells. And most of them are.
It's not quite as bad, but it's 50-50. It's really, in terms of water use in Cyprus, it's 50-50.
Yeah, the volume that is.
Yeah.
Okay. Ali, you wanted to ask?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Lange. Actually, my question is concerning dams. Is there any tendency for the future to resort more to underground storage? When drought is increasing, this means that ambient temperatures are increasing. That means evapotranspiration is increasing. And in any case, 50% is evaporating now, let's say, plus or minus. So it might become 70%.
A good point. I don't think the government has yet come to grips with this problem. As you see, they rely on the wet years, hoping that they carry over enough water to the dry years, despite increase, as you rightly point out, despite increased evaporation. There is an increasing, I mentioned that there is an increasing tendency of recharge of reservoirs, which I think is great. In fact, if they would manage to use treated wastewater, tertiary treated wastewater to recharge reservoirs, that's another measure that I think is, again, tertiary treated. So it's not, it's good water. You look worried, but anyway. But I mean, through check dams. But the problem, of course, if you don't have precipitation, rivers don't have water, so check dams don't do you any good, right? I mean, so it depends. After all, it depends on precipitation. If precipitation is absent, all you can do is desalinate, I'm afraid. And be very conscious of your water consumption and save water. I'm afraid that's. But I mean, again, your point of not replacing, but complementing storage in dams by other means of storage, and I think really recharge of aquifers is a good way of doing that. Is a good idea, and I think Cyprus it is doing this to some extent, but they should maybe increase recharge of aquifers in good years more than they used to avoid losing the water through evaporation in the warm years.
Nadim, you have a question?
Sorry. Following up on question asked wells. How are wells registered in Cyprus? How many are legal or illegal? Because in Lebanon, what was referred to as number of wells is that a lot of them are illegally drilled, and we don't know how much they're pumping and at what depth they are. There is no well log with those. Is this the
Well, there's
same
actually
in
a story to that. Yeah, well, in fact, well, I mean, if you're a law-abiding citizen, you go to the Water Development Department and hand in a request, and the request will eventually be granted, and then you can drill your well. And then it's metered, and the government knows what's happening. Now, in fact, there were times in the past where the government encouraged people to drill wells, more or less to make up for the insufficient infrastructure that the government had provided at that time. To what extent these wells were ever registered, I have doubts, to be honest with you. And as I said, now the government is trying to sort of make up for it to some extent by trying to locate the wells and how they're going to deal with it, if they're going to impose any sort of fines or other issue, or if they will then force people to meter their private wells as well. I don't really know, to be honest with you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Manfred. Now we will move to Dr. Nadim Farajalla's presentation on Lebanon's case, and he will also be presenting some preliminary results from a research study that is being conducted by the Climate Change Program at IFI.
Good morning. I will try to present our take on the Lebanon case. We were hoping to have an official government position or quasi-official government position through the advisor to the Minister of Energy and Water, but unfortunately she could not make it, and you're stuck with me, giving you my point of view. So just a little background as to where we are in Lebanon. We get about 8,600 million cubic meters of rainfall in Lebanon, and this rain is drained by 40 streams, about 17 of which are perennial, and the remaining are seasonal. And the total flow through these is about 3,900 million cubic meters. Unlike Cyprus, we only have two major dams. Actually, one is major, one is quite minor. But the capacity of one of our dams, on the Qaraun Dam on the Litani River, is nearly twice of what Cyprus stores. I mean, we're at 220 million cubic meters. The Shabrouh Dam is one that collects anywhere from 6 to 12 million, but the average number is 9 million. The numbers are not very exact. This is just a flow chart to show you where our water goes. We lose 4.5 billion cubic meters to evaporation and evapotranspiration. We get across-boundary losses of about 1 billion that go through surface and subsurface waters, and we've got about 0.4 billion that go into the sea as sea springs. So the remaining waters in Lebanon that are renewable are 2.7 billion cubic meters. And these are found in surface flows of 2.2 billion and in groundwater flows of about 0.5 billion. The demand we have is quite extensive. We have around 1.5 billion cubic meters per year, then demand 61% of which goes to agriculture and 18% for domestic use, with industry using up 11%. And contrary to many claims, we are not water rich. If you look at the per capita demand, 900 annual per capita demand, we have 926 meters cubed per person. This is lower than the 1,000 meter cubed per year per person. That's the benchmark for water scarcity. This number is expected to drop. That is, these numbers, by the way, are given with normal population growth in Lebanon. We've had an influx of refugees that nearly, some would say, around 2 million or something like that. So half of the Lebanese population increased. We had an increase of 50% in over a year or two. And that number, the 839 cubic meters, I'm sure is we are now well below that. The water infrastructure in Lebanon is not so good. We've got lots of leaks. We lose about 48% nationally of all that water that's distributed. So before even starting to think about what to do with water, we need to stop those leaks. We've got a national water strategy, sector strategy that has been developed, and part of it aims to, through part of it, there's an aim to build the storage capacity to about 650 million cubic meters on an annual basis. In looking at data we have worked on at AUB through a couple of my graduate students, we tracked rainfall from 1874 till 2003. That's when we were still getting our data for free. Now we pay for our data. And nobody's here from the government. Pardon? We collected data. At AUB, we have been collecting data since 1874. So our data set went from 1874 to 1975. And then the airport was set up in Lebanon in 1930, and we started collecting data from 1930 nearly continuously till now. We've got some gaps during the war. So we joined those data sets. We did whatever mathematical wizardry needed to be done to make a continuous data set, and this is what we came up with. There is no discernible trend in precipitation decrease, none that we could see statistically. But that doesn't mean that we are not headed there. I mean, we've got models that are showing that we are going there, and we see that. In looking at rainfall incidents where we got lower rain than the average, and we used what the government uses. The government developed its national water sector strategy at 70% of the rainfall that we would get. In declaring drought or determining drought, they went to 40% of what rain we get. So these are the numbers we got. We've got, if you look at this, this is an interesting distribution of this. We got two consecutive years in the 30s where we got very low rainfall, and again the 50s was a terrible decade. We got in the 50s, if you want, 8 of the 10 years of the 50s were below average rainfall, 2 of which were considered as drought. In 1976 we got a year that was considered a drought year, with a question mark here on whether 75 had enough data for us to declare it, because in 75, at the onset of the war, everything went down the tube, and we didn't get anything. So another, then 89, 90, we got another episode of low rainfall, which is considered to be drought condition, and then 1999. 2000, now that's where my data set stopped, 2003. You go forward some more, just looking back, 2010 was a terrible year as well. So we've got 2010, we've got 2014 that do not show up on this. A student of mine did her thesis on predicting what drought conditions would look like given different climatic changes that we expect to experience. We used the RDI, the Reconnaissance Drought Index, rather than the SPI. The simple reason is we don't have enough data to develop for the SPI or in a short time that we had. And the RDI was developed specifically for the Mediterranean region and requires 2 sets of data, rainfall and evapotranspiration, which could be calculated through temperature data alone, with a little bit of other locational data. And we ran through models and predictions as the scenarios were developed, and we went through different scenarios where we decreased precipitation and increased evapotranspiration. And we found out that within the next, I wouldn't say few decades, let's say, instead of having a normal cycle where we'd have a drought or two every 6 years, or a couple of droughts every 10 years, we found out that this eventually would flip. We'd have one normal year in 6 or 2 normal years in 10. And this is just a building on a scenario that we developed. Looking at the management of our water, the primary mover and shaker on this is the Ministry of Energy and Water, and it supposed to produce national water policies and strategies, and operates at a national scale in relation to water resources management, monitoring, and control. The design and building and implementation of major water facilities, mainly dams, is part of the work of this ministry, as well as hill lakes that are greater than 200,000 cubic meter in volume. Also, major water conveyance and supply networks are the purview of this ministry. The Ministry of Agriculture sort of monitors precipitation levels, but dedicated for agricultural purposes. Through the Ministry of Agriculture, I need to interject here, the Lebanese Agricultural Research Institute has set up about 44 weather stations throughout Lebanon that are connected to a central location in Tel Amara. And this data is supposed to be accessible, but not very accessible. But it's a recent network which gives us a good opportunity to start our monitoring program. The Ministry of Agriculture also works on large-scale irrigation schemes. The Ministry of Environment sets and produces policies and sets up regulations related to the environment and the use of natural resources. Of particular importance here is the discharge quality, water quality standards of water. Coming back to what Fidele said, we seem to be reactive. We are reactive. We have never taken the initiative. The only initiative taken has been the National Water Sector Strategy as a strategy in recent times. But come May, even later, June, government woke up and decided, oops, we have a problem here. The rain isn't as much as we thought it was. Yes. And given that we as an academia and civil society had been talking endlessly about we are in trouble with low rainfall, we are in trouble with low rainfall, we need to do something. And then up comes up Jack and says, hey, let's have a parliamentary committee on scarcity. And it was chaired by the Parliamentary Committee of Public Works chairman, Mr. Khabani, and they had directors generals and advisors. Everybody went into this, and they met. And they had some nice recommendations. Establishment of another committee. Okay? And then they said, we have to manage our water properly. And then the gem of it all, transfer water by tankers from Turkey, as if we have the infrastructure to carry it from the sea into inland. And then they said we will want to enact emergency irrigation measures, to adopt irrigation measures. And if you look at this, the farmer gets the shaft at the end of the day, always. So the Interministerial Committee comes along in May, and again they met, and they said we need to monitor the drought situation during summer, which is excellent. We haven't heard from them. They needed to follow up and advise concerned institutions on recommendations to overcome the crisis. What did we end up with? A billboard campaign that tells people save water. And what measures are proposed? Nothing. It's just a billboard campaign. Looks nice. And then they provided a proposal to the Council of Ministers to address the situation if and when needed. That's another issue. That's really weird. Again, the water scarcity team that was set up had all the right ministries. I'm not here looking at anything that's wrong with the composition. It's just that the timing is so awfully wrong with the measures that are so awfully limited. And all the 4 water establishments were represented. The Litani River was represented. The Ministry of Agriculture, Industry, Interior, Environment, our super ministry, the Council for Development and Reconstruction, the Public Health Ministry, Ministry of Information, and the Ministry of Public Works, especially the Town Planning, Tanzim al-Mudani, were involved. Fantastic ministry. This should be our water board, but nobody's taking this any further. The Ministry of Energy and Water came up with some initiatives through the National Water Sector Strategy, and that's before the drought was upon us. And it was these initiatives were divided into 2. One was infrastructure, one was in management. So one is hard measures, and then the other is soft measures. On the infrastructure side, there was a tendency to look at additional water resources through optimizing surface water storage, looking into artificial recharge of groundwater, and surface storage using dams and hill lakes. The other component of this infrastructure initiative went through the conveyance of water through improved water supply transmission and storage, extending and rehabilitating distribution networks with the installation of meters. We are not a metered society. We do not know how much water people are using. We cheat. We are allowed a certain amount of water that is given to us. We bribe the water warden or the water guy, and يفتح السكر, as we say, and we get more water. And we pay for just a little when we do. And then another part of the infrastructure initiative is the rehabilitation and expansion of irrigation networks. And then something that we've not been doing is collecting and treating wastewater. We've been collecting wastewater for sure, and then discharging it into rivers and into the sea and into dry wells, where we end up with water, sewage water entering our aquifers, and then we pump that aquifer and use it, and we get sick and go to hospital. We pay money for that, and then we lose more productivity of our citizenry. The management initiative was divided into institutional and organizational format, where we get streamlined and better services rendered, financial and commercial aspect, legal and regulatory, and then the final is the environmental concerns. These are all published by the ministry, and they're available through the National Water Sector Strategy. I'm not going to go into detail on those. The Ministry of Agriculture has Larry, I told you about the Lebanese Agricultural Research Institute, and they are really active in farmer awareness. They work hand in hand with farmers. They are one of the more active governmental institutes. They have a Hasad project, and we've put up the link for it to it so that you can look at it yourself. CNRS set up a control room to monitor natural resources, including one of which is water. This is, and it's a fairly good state-of-the-art project, but then it's still limited. And then we have the Water Parliamentary Committee to draft water action plan for short-term and long-term solution to our water crises. Let's talk about the gaps, and I'll interject it in here. Our success, I measure one, the success is one that I think of, and that's the development finally of a national water sector strategy. I'm not saying it's a great strategy. I'm not saying it's a bad strategy. It's a strategy for once we've got a strategy to build on. So that's one. What gaps do we have? Law 221 amendment sort of clashes with the national water sector strategy. And then the operations of all our projects are project basis. It's not within a major plan that's going on. So we have project basis gaps. Shortcomings, it is always political bickering. If one party comes up with a plan, the other party tries to shoot it down just because they did it and we didn't do it. It might be a great plan, but then that political bickering brings it down. Our major focus is not on a preemptive level, it's on a reactive level. So now we're looking at post-drought actions. Drought came upon us, what do we do? Nothing. There is a lack of awareness at all levels. Government officials at high management, mid-management, and low management, and everywhere, are not really aware of the issues that are at hand and what levels and how we can interject and come in and manage our water resources. There is a general lack of coordination between ministries and the relevant agencies. And then again, this is in capital letters, we do not have a drought management plan. The drought management plan is not just about water, it's about the people that are affected by this water. If farmers are made, and they were made, to stop irrigating. For example, we were in Qabiliyas in around May, and a directive was issued by the municipality of Qabiliyas, which has its own well and was supplying water to farmers who were planting vegetables, etc. And they were told you can plant one round or one season, if you will, one harvest instead of two, because they wanted to divert that water to the orchards, because orchards are perennial and they would lose, and the loss of an orchard is a long-term loss that is very difficult to recover, whereas vegetables are planted on an annual basis and farmers can recover. Nobody paid farmers any compensation on that. So this is an issue that we need to look at when we're looking at the drought management plan. It's not just water. Recommendations. Again, we need a drought management plan. We need to focus on water demand management as key to our planning, and then we need to set up our water board. We do have a need for a water board, and this is essential for us to set up to manage water across all sectors. So I would, I think, stop with this, and then I will share with you in a little bit if you have any questions, and then we'll go on to the...
Okay, we'll take some questions now before we go on to the results. Yes.
I have a sorry, I have a question for maybe the three presenters in total. All of the water management strategies shown have been primarily top-down, government-driven approaches. And if you can assume, you know, let's make the assumption that we can come up with a good plan in the government, and then we make the assumption that it actually gets enacted, we also need to then make the assumption that it can be enforced. And this is not a problem that is in the MENA region. This is globally. So top-down approaches may work in certain areas, but my question is, would, at the end of the day, these are strategies to mitigate a long-term problem where you really need to focus on behavioral changes in usage, which was in Dr. Lange's talk about harvesting rainwater and groundwater recharge for landscape irrigation, a small percentage of the water usage, but still a behavioral change that you're going for as part of your plan. So my question is, would it not be occasionally, or maybe in the majority of cases, better to use a bottom-up approach to engage growers, if you're looking at agriculture, to engage urban residents or rural residents, projects like fog collecting or small-scale projects where you can get a win-win. You can get a behavioral change, and you can get a water usage reduction or more efficient water usage reduction, as well as education. Would a bottom-up approach at times be more effective than a top-down approach? And I guess, has there been any examples of these in any of these regions that have worked?
You want to start?
I have a couple of things. I don't believe in either a top-down or a bottom-up approach. Either one doesn't work by itself. It has to be shared government, participatory approach to all of these plans. You cannot set up a plan and ignore the stakeholders. You set up a plan, listen, it depends when you bring them in. You can have a consultative meeting and be aware of what the concerns are of the various stakeholders, set up a plan, bring them back in again for discussion, and then that would be a good buy-in to the plan. You have to have people buy in into your plan. Behavioral change comes through a a campaign of awareness and really shared responsibility for a resource. So when people feel that they share this responsibility, they will act on that. An example of a good case where it's sort of both levels work is Anjar in Lebanon, where they do, I think it's not an official water users association because we do not have water users associations yet. Maybe one is being formed. But in Anjar, the community developed their own management scheme, and this is organized or maintained, not even organized. It was organized way back in the 30s or 20s, and now it is being overseen and helped along by the municipality and the elders of the town. So Labwe, it's the same. I don't know of Labwe, I know for Anjar. And this is where community took over the management of a resource. But then on a national scale, when you're looking at conflicting uses of that water, you need somebody of a higher authority to step in to make sure that nobody is unfairly treated. That's my give on Lebanon's case.
Just briefly, I just can sort of reinforce what Nadim is saying. I also think that you need both. You need both bottom-up and top-down approaches to water management. But you should not ignore the bottom-up, certainly. You do need the involvement of the major stakeholders, people who are, in the end, affected by whatever policy you come up with. So that's really important. I think your point. Sorry, one step back. I think that maybe a prerequisite for making that more effective is indeed that you have a central body that people can talk to. And that's why I'm so happy that in Cyprus, after, again, a long period of having all these ministries involved, and everybody have its own agenda, they have decided that, no, it's one ministry. So stakeholders know who to talk to. I think that's really important in making that effective. The other point about behavioral change, yes, indeed, you do need that. And I'm afraid that even though people are, of course, sort of happy and welcome the provision of potable water through desalination, I think, in a sense, it's the wrong step, because it makes people just think, water, not a problem. Open the faucet, out it comes. So I think this should have been really paired with an increasing campaign explaining that this is a very costly way of providing water, and let alone the issue of CO2 emissions. It's, on a global scale, it's nothing. But of course, again, it goes back to behavioral issues of being aware that even on a small scale, we contribute to global warming to some extent as well. Anyway, so I think the issue of starting very early with making people aware is important, and the Water Development Department does have programs. They do go to schools. They do have campaigns of making people aware of water saving. If this is sufficient, I don't know, but at least it's better than nothing. Let's put it this way.
Yeah, the problem with water is like the problem with pastures or air. They fall in the tragedy of the commons. In that the people tend to see them as public goods. And as all public goods, people tend to use them as much as they can, thinking that the other one will be the one to tighten his belt. So unless there is a stronger activist or tragedy is already there, that there's no more water, then the people will start to act. So most probably, in order to have a bottom-up approach, there will have to be a massive campaign to highlight that water scarcity is a real issue that they have to deal with right from the start.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Farajalla, for sharing with us these thoughts. Actually, back in 2003, I wrote a short review on water as a human right, and I based my information on whatever was found in the literature. 10 years later now, we're still, after the water strategy, all the studies I'm seeing are basing their information on what was measured back 1930s, concerning precipitation and concerning mainly runoff. Who says that we still have 8.6 billion cubic meters of precipitation? Who's doing the measurement and who's doing the calculation? When was the last calculation done? I'm not challenging you, I'm challenging the... My take now on the current policies, strategies is that whatever is based on something which is wrong, the end conclusion will be completely wrong, will be a disaster. The more important issue is the issue of runoff. Most of the rain falling in Lebanon, as you surely know, falls on the western part of the chain. I mean, before it reaches the Bekaa, although there is a significant amount which reaches there. But the majority is on the western side. The coast has become a concrete jungle. Concrete meaning that in Beirut or in the other neighboring cities, we have construction limits, or no limits actually, construction factors of 100%. That means you cannot put your finger in the soil in Beirut. You cannot even plant a tree, and basically infiltration is prohibited by law. Not joking, this is the truth. Whatever falls on every rooftop goes straight into the sea. Whatever falls doesn't go in the drainage canals, it becomes a flood even with 2 millimeters of rainfall like what happened yesterday. So it's enough to have 2 millimeters of rainfall and you'll see a flooded highway and people will say, oh, catastrophe, a flood, look at the water. And we have people ready to take this issue and see, look where our water is being lost. But reality is that these are a couple of millimeters that were collected over several square kilometers. The issue here is we need really, we're embarking on a project from our side to do some measurements on runoff, but we need really to measure runoff to determine exactly how much water we have available. The end figures of 2.2 billion or whatever is left might be and are surely much less than reality, and we are in a much worse situation than we are now. This is what I wanted only to highlight. To add on your...
The question in there, shall I?
No, Yani, if you have something to say on this. And
measuring runoff, how? Now I want to ask you this question, because what you have to measure is what precipitates. Our major mistake or error in our measurement in Lebanon is the amount of and the extent of snow that we get. Snow measurements, the water equivalent of snow, is dependent not only on the extent of snow and the length of the snow cover, but the density of the snow. And we do not have any. Maybe we still have one up in Mzar that the Université Saint-Joseph put up, but I doubt that it's still working there. But instead of just measuring the snow, we need to measure the snow density, and we have not done that. There have been some attempts at remote sensing measurements, etc., but then you still have to ground truth. Runoff, we need to gauge all our rivers, and most of our rivers are run dry, and the equipment that we put in is still a little bit on the archaic side. We're not even using Doppler for low flows. So I find it extremely interesting to find out how you will be measuring runoff, especially in our urban jungle that extends from Juni to Saida.
No, it's easy. It's not easy, easier said than done. No, actually, CDR have done gigantic efforts to establish in the cities, major cities, some sewage networks. We don't have sewage treatment sewage treatment units, but we have large pipes pouring the water into the sea. And you can see the water coming out when it rains, basically. All you have to do is to measure those major pipes, especially coming out from Beirut on both sides.
You will be contributing in this method, you'll be contributing to this information. If I may. If I may. You need, there are
We'll
better
see. We'll look at it. Because again, many proposals for a better water management were talking about or are talking about collecting rainwater.
Yeah.
How are you going to collect rainwater in Beirut? Simply
Just let me correct one thing that you said. Our error is we are estimating rainfall on the lower side rather than on the high side. Just to keep that.
Precipitation?
Yes.
I don't think. It's debatable. Let's talk later.
Okay, okay, Rayan.
Hi, Rayan Lamin from Assam Faris Institute. I have a much less technical question, and it's somewhat the elephant in the room a lot of times in terms of what the government does in the state of Lebanon. And the most famous saying for a Lebanese is Wain ad-Dawli, the fact that there isn't a state that, obviously manages and plans and does all the things that other governments do. So usually the default then is to think about privatization. And as we know that this is, I'm against privatization just to make sure that that's out there. But at the same time, it's a strategy that I think that sometimes our government officials that don't do their job, who I don't think are even in the room right now, end up thinking about privatization. So if there's government officials, they can maybe respond to that, not just to Nadim, but I'd like to hear what Nadim has to say too.
See, I'm very much along your lines. I'm totally against privatization, especially of what we've seen with the mobile services that we get here. And we're having sent that out to privatization and the lack of progress that we got. There have been several examples of where privatization in the water sector has not worked. And especially in countries similar to Lebanon in development, in Latin America, for example, etc. So to some extent, privatization in the maintenance and the management of the networks could be done or, outsourced. But in terms of the resource itself, how it's divided, where water allocation comes into issue, I am very much afraid of letting the government go of this resource. That's my personal view, and I think it's shared by some, not many. I will not talk about the other big elephant in the room, the what's it called? The blue gold.
Hello, Salon Saadi from FAO. I have a few observations and a question to mine. First, concerning reuse of treated wastewater, I would like to bring to your attention that there is a national guidelines for reuse of treated wastewater in Lebanon. It was finalized in 2012 and adopted by all ministries concerned, but unfortunately is still at a voluntary basis, not mandatory to all station of treatment. And we as FAO with the Ministry of Agriculture, we are doing a program of extension to the farmers in the region of Fiat to reuse treated wastewater in agriculture. Because Ihat is the only, at this scale, the only station that is dedicated for reuse in agriculture. Unfortunately, for the station of Ihat, the problem is still at small scale with the farmers because the inflow to the station is very low, and it means the outflow is also low. So the number of farmers are very limited who are using the treated wastewater. I will not enter into the problem of this station, but this is to keep it simple. Another issue concerning the Water Association, there is also, we have an experience with the Ministry of Water and Ministry of Agriculture in Marjayoun for the management of the Dardara source, and the community are unfortunately, we don't have a law for the establishment of Water Users Association, but they have been gathered in a like association, cooperative, but they are working like if they are a Water User Association. My question is about the water establishment. How we can talk about drought water management if we don't have at the basis an irrigation water management, especially that water like other countries like Cyprus and so on are taking more than 60% of the water, of the resources at the country. If you look to the water establishment, they don't, I would not say they don't care, but they are not very much interested about managing irrigation, water for irrigation, because there is no, for them, any return. So we need to solve this problem and reinforce the water establishment, because the law of 221, it gave them this authority to manage the water for irrigation, but unfortunately, it didn't give them the means and the possibilities to do it. So water establishment are a key player in the whole institution and figure of the water management. How we can integrate them, it would be great if you can give any answer on that.
Okay. Yeah, I know of the reuse of waste, of treated wastewater. I worked on putting in some of the standards with the Ministry of Environment when it was about 8 years ago, when it was first started, and then it took a long time to develop. There is another instance about reuse of wastewater, and it's really interesting to know about. It's in Baalbek, when they try to, yes, exactly. And the story before it is that the farmers would not allow the construction or the connection of the sewage pipeline to the facility, because they used to use the raw sewage in irrigation, and they didn't want to lose that resource. So until they were convinced that that water will come back to them in a better condition, they allowed the construction and the operation.
This is the problem. Because the one who are using raw water, wastewater, I didn't want it to enter into that. Are the Baalbek people.
Yes.
While the treated water are going to Aad people. So Baalbek people wanted to have a replacement to the water they are using, and the Italian cooperation dig too well for them, and in order to get water for irrigation. But unfortunately now they are nagging that they don't have fuel to pump the water. So it's a cycle of problem, and it needs to be resolved.
Okay, so that's, and addressing the Water Users Association, especially the Marjayoun and the Spanish donation for that. The Abdel Al organization, Iman, with Ibrahim Abdel Al, Jamaat Ibrahim Abdel Al, they had taken a lead on developing and training people on developing Water Users Association, with the lead for developing new laws that would be enacted in Parliament. But then you know the situation that we have here. For the Water Users establishments, you're talking about, we've got somebody here of extensive experience that I do not dare speak too much in front of, and I'm afraid I'm looking at him right now. Mr. Jabir has extensive experience with what happened and what's happening now. So I'm sure he will correct me if I step out of bounds. The water establishments did not have, when they were water authorities, did not have any jurisdiction over irrigation water. They were strictly working with water supply, not even sewage, nothing. Now when they moved to this, the water establishments did not have the capacity to work with irrigation. They don't have the ability to hire now because there's a general freeze freeze on hiring people, and the levying of charges to be able to manage these resources, because you need money to manage it, is not within the jurisdiction of these water establishments. So that's the issue that we have with those. I don't know if there is anything more that needs to be said. Okay.
They have the possibility to get money for drinking water. Why not for irrigation?
They do.
I know,
They do, but they don't have the ability or the knowledge of managing this. They do not know how to manage it.
Other public institutions are recruiting and hiring people. I can list for you many ministries hiring people. There is an issue about water establishment. They need to be reinforced. Otherwise, we will be losing our time because they are on the ground managing water.
Okay, one thing I want to say that I think will answer everything, and Alice alluded to it. If we don't measure it, we cannot manage it. And we are not measuring our water resources, we are not able to manage it. So that goes to the basis of it.
Okay, thank you. I think we'll move now to the final presentation, and then we can take another round of questions.
Let me tell you a little bit of what we, a few months ago, we started thinking. It takes us a long time to think. But we started looking at when the drought issue started coming up, we thought, we need to do something at this institute. We have to do something. But again, we had very little money to work with. Yes. But the skies opened up, and lo and behold, we got some money, a very little bit amount of money. And Rana here worked very hard to convince the gods of money to give us a little bit of money. And a month ago, we got that money. And we started, yes. And we got that money from the Carnegie Institute. And they were very generous because they had some money left over, and keys were turned, and the Carnegie Institute gave us money to do this event and to do the data collection that we did. What we did was as follows. We thought the drought that we are facing, or the scarcity of water that we're facing on a short level, impacts everybody. And when we say everybody, everybody nags, and we in Lebanon nag. It's a given. The weather comes up, it's sunny, oof, it's sunny. And then it rains, oof, it's raining. We never are satisfied, but still we need to put a value to how much we are suffering from. So we initially, given the tight money we had, we said we'd look at the non-conventional side of issues. We know farmers use a lot of water, we know households use a lot of water, and to ask questions of these two groups would take a long time, and we had just a month's worth of money. So we hit the industry sector and the tourism sector. In industry, we looked at all those industries that use water in their production and in running their businesses. In tourism, we looked at restaurants, we looked at hotels, we looked at water parks, we looked at ski resorts, all of these that rely on water in terms of either precipitation, snow for ski resorts, or in river parks. We have a couple of, we looked at 5 river clubs that are on the Hasi and the Litani, and these rely directly on rainfall runoff. And then whatever is stored is relied upon by the other institutes. We have here right hot, right as we say, right out of the oven, very new information that was put together over the weekend, because we just finished, and you'll see the extent of work we've done over the weekend. Patricia Idamus, she's standing there, did a monumental job in putting this and making sense of it. And Roland, even though he's sitting cross-handed over there, he was instrumental also in helping us. So this information is not mine. Anything wrong is Patricia's fault. Everything that's right is mine. So, no, Roland is just there. He looks nice sitting there. So I'll share with you what we have about this. The motivation and the implementation was that 45% of the natural precipitation we got we got last year. And in this sense, this 45% sort of matches what the IPCC's fifth assessment report and prior to that, the fourth assessment report, and what the Cyprus Institute helped the Lebanese Ministry of Environment do with the second national communication by modeling. There was an anticipation of reaching 40% decrease in precipitation. So what happened last year in terms of precipitation decrease sort of is a window into the future. This is, guys, this is what's going to happen to us in the future. So this was a great incentive for us to work on. And then also, the study we wanted to look at was to really quantify these losses in terms of productivity by within the different sectors that we were looking at. So as I said, we looked at the industrial sector and tourism. We are continuing with some additional money we will be talking to farmers, and we will be doing interviews with households. So if you would like to help us later on by answering our questions, we will call you, given your registration here. So the surveys designed for each, they were specifically designed for each sector, and we had a phone survey conducted. And the survey looked at sources of water, we looked at peak operational months where most of the water was used, the size of the operation by looking at the number of employees, not the production size. The water, the industry or the establishment used, how much water, how much money they paid for their water, what were the functions that where water was used in, and the percent operating costs spent on water, and if any adaptation measures were taken, we wanted to look at those. So starting with the industry, if you look at the dark blue lines, this is the distribution of industries throughout Lebanon. And brown is how the percentage of the targeted industries we looked at. So we looked at a lot into the food and beverage industry, we looked at chemicals, and we looked at non-mineral, and I'll talk a little bit about the descriptions of these. And what we found out that the water sector, the water sources within the industrial sector, we compared only last year to this year. Again, we run into the issue of data. We have major problems with data. So last year and this year, it's still fresh in people's mind, and we could still ask. So only 1% of the industries used rainwater harvesting. That was last year. And within this year, it was at 6% as a source of springs were their source. Nothing has changed. Last year, only 12% of the industries sought water from private vendors. This jumped to 32% this year. And those that were operating their wells, 37% relied on their own wells last year, whereas 34% relied on it this year, probably because of the lack of rainfall and their wells running dry. And last year, 44% of the industries looked at the public water supply as a source. This year, it fell down to 29%. So you could see how this year, the shrinkage in the public supply and then the people looking for alternate sources. We need to look at something here. The amount paid for water in 2013, 2014 is 150% of what was paid last year. And you could see the number. The average per industry is about 9.5 million. This year it's 24 million. Forget the increase percent column. That's something wrong. This all resulted in a 2% increase in total operating costs going into water. And 10% of the industries identified a loss in production, but only 2% reported increasing prices of products. This means they got a hit on this. They paid more, but they still internalized the costs. Now, we divided adaptation into two parts. We looked at the technical adaptation, where 8% of the industries looked at water treatment, cost of 17 million Lebanese pounds per industry. And the funny thing is this testing of water quality. The issue is, in many industries, the water has to have a certain quality. And by buying it from a vendor, you don't know what the quality is. And to preempt any malfunctioning of your system, you needed to make sure that the water quality is good. And this means that industries had to test their water. 4% of the industries tested their water on an average cost of 2 million. Water saving equipment and production, 1% used it, and you could see the cost was extremely high, 68 million Lebanese pounds. Not many, I mean 2%, but still, drilling of wells, of new wells, or the rehabilitation and expansion of existing ones to a cost of 23 million Lebanese pounds was conducted. Now we come to behavioral change, and this is really important. 7% encouraged their operations to reuse water at a cost of 2.5 million. Water saving procedures were adopted by 3% at cost of 12 million, and awareness campaigns for staff was conducted by many, 44%. They said at no cost. The no cost maybe that they felt, but that's significant in and of itself. Now, moving into water users in the tourism industry, we looked at restaurants, hotels, venues where they hold weddings and ceremonies, water clubs, beach resorts, country clubs. We looked at river clubs, ski resorts, and still the survey is not over yet. It's still ongoing. It should be noted that unlike industry, tourism is very vulnerable to political and security unrest, and this puts people off coming here to Lebanon. And like our Tunisian colleague could not come here because of political unrest in Syria, and he needed to get special clearance from his authorities to come into Lebanon because they were afraid that he would go into Syria. 60-year-old fighting in Syria doesn't mean much sense. But so we looked at, if you could see all the industries all the trades within the tourism that we looked at are in the navy blue line, and the blue is what we needed to have statistically significant or meaningful data. And the green line, if you see, is it green up there? Yeah. The green is where we are at right now. The surveys are ongoing. We'll keep asking people until we reach the blue line. Again, sources of water for the tourism sector, still between last year 6% relied on springs, this year 5%, again lack of water probably. Last year 6% harvested rainwater, this year 5%, less water to harvest. Private vendors 10% last year, this year 35%. And again, the wells are very much similar to what we saw with the industry sector, and then the reliance on the public supply, it's much higher in the tourism sector than in the industrial sector, and that shrank significantly here. So there is a significant hit that's being taken by the tourism industry. Last year, amount percentage paid for by each for water. Last year they paid more because they used probably more. And this year, in terms of the private sector, you could see the change in the payments. And then again, wells and well pumping is lower, reflecting to what the sources are. The tourism sector pays less money for accessing water. And this might be, if you look at it in one sense, because there is a 71% of the industries reported in occupancy rate decrease, 27% decrease in occupancy. That means less people using water. So that's why that's one of the explanations we were thinking of regarding why they're paying less. Plus the processes involved in industry require more water, etc. 41% of the institutions reduced their water consumption by 21%. In terms of recreational use, and this is quite telling, The economic loss incurred by clubs on rivers was about 311 million Lebanese pounds, which represents 78% of the income gained in 2013. So they had a loss of 78% of their income. The decrease in number of tickets is displayed below. Look at the ski resorts. They had a nearly 100% loss. Nobody came up to ski. Only one resort operator opened for 2 days last year. So the losses were quite high and severe for these industries. And since we don't have a drought management plan, these people pay out of their pocket. Okay? So again, we looked at what adaptation measures there were and treatment, pre or post. Again, pre before getting it in and post treatment because distributed to their users. Again, 4 million Lebanese pounds, with 2% using that option. Testing of water quality was at 1%, 900,000 Lebanese pounds. Water saving devices, and that's where this aspect works really well. We need to look into retrofitting and making sure that all new construction builds in water saving devices. And 3% of the industry reported using that, and the cost was 1.7 million. Again, wells and expansion of those, you could see that the number is, that the value is quite high, 10 million pounds. Behavioral change, water reuse and water saving procedures were used, and as well as, again, the awareness campaigns amongst their workers was similar to that of industry. So the management realizes the issue of water and the scarcity of water, and they try to raise awareness, but they're not finding any support from the other side, which is the government side. And if just a comparison here of how much is paid by tourism per sector, 7 million in average payment and 9 million for the industries. Total for a year, if you want on per average, again, 12 million this year and 24 million. So then the numbers are quite high. So our work is ongoing, and we're still waiting for more analysis, and we will be posting all of our findings on our website once we are sure and the values, the numbers are vetted and clear. And we will hopefully be adding agriculture and domestic use.
Okay, I will take some questions now. Yes, Jeremy.
The first thing, I would find it hard to believe there was no cost associated with awareness campaigns, even if only an opportunity cost for the company. But I'm curious, the results for the tourism sector, those are total numbers. So if you took that cost increase and factored in also the decrease in numbers and did the cost per person served in the tourism sector, it probably would be as striking as the industrial sector.
It is not normalized per user, as you were saying. It is high, but it is just, the thing is, you have to realize what we did. The numbers we got is by people estimating their payments. They were not. Some did look at receipts and payments they made. Others just thought about how much it is. So the numbers, think of them as indicative. But you're right in terms of if you normalize the amount of payments that's made per user rather than how much they're lost in use, the numbers could rise, yes.
And I wonder, could you also do that in the industrial sector, because the tourists that come to the country would buy the products produced by these industry domestically?
Not
Is that
necessarily.
A little bit
Not necessarily.
Too many degrees of separation?
But what we could do is look at the gross production cost, or how much they're making in terms of product that they're selling, and then factor into how much that as a percentage that they paid for water, and then the percentages would then become, I think, striking.
Okay, Madame Solange.
I would like to ask if you are looking on the impact of the water price on the final product they are selling. how much in percentage it will be affecting the final product?
It's difficult because there are so many industries, and it's going to be difficult for us to do that. And they do not, they're afraid of لما حدا يزعل, the Senora effect. If they tell us how much they're making, then the taxman comes in. So
Is up there.
Thank you for your lecture first. Then I want to ask you about Brahim Abdelal wrote a project about Litani River 800 for feeding areas that are below 800 in amplitude, 800 meters, of course. And I want to ask if the implementation of this project would solve the Lebanese water problem. And when would they start in this project? Because it was written maybe 50 years ago. I don't know if they started yet.
you are mixing things together. Canal 800 has nothing to do with the Abdel Al project. Okay, it is a government initiative that is funded by the Kuwaiti Fund. And the Abdel Al organization, what they're doing is they're working on developing and helping farmers and communities at the downstream side of the canal to organize into water users associations so that they can manage the water they get into their community. So it is starting, the building is there, they're building they've started construction, and the system that they want to use is what they call the water hydrant system, where you prepay and you have something like a credit card that you pay for enough water to distribute. This is coming into play right now. But it will be a while before. It will solve part of the problem for the people in the south because there is not a river running through that area at all. So that would help. And part of the Litani, the principle for the Litani, the dam on the Litani, is to supply the south with water. So this is finally, after 50 years of the construction of the dam, they're now supplying water to the south.
Okay, any more questions? Okay, I would like to thank you all for coming today and for the interesting discussion. I'd like to thank our panelists one more time, Dr. Manfred, Lange, and Fidele, and of course, Dr. Farajalla. Thank you all. Please, can have some coffee.